Clive pulled into the parking lot of Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center, one of the best, but also most expensive, oncology hospitals in New York. Rain drizzled down in fine needles against the windshield, but he barely noticed. He glanced at the passenger seat, where a box of pastries sat next to a bouquet of roses and a few helium balloons tied to the dashboard. Today was Kathleen's 31st birthday, but instead of celebrating at home, she was spending it here, undergoing another round of chemotherapy. The thought of it twisted something inside him. He cut the engine. Her words echoed in his head. "Don't come, honey. I don't want you to see me like this." But he loved her, and he wanted to be here for her. Clive stepped inside, shaking the rain from his coat, and approached the reception desk. A young woman in a white coat looked up from her computer, offering him a polite, professional smile. "Good morning. I'm here to visit my wife, Kathleen Williams." She nodded and began typing. Her fingers moved quickly, eyes scanning the screen, until her expression changed. A slight frown formed between her brows. She typed the name again, then once more. Finally, she looked up. "I'm sorry, sir, but we don't have a patient by that name." He blinked, not understanding. "You must be mistaken," he said. "She's been receiving treatment here for 6 months, breast cancer." The receptionist shook her head gently. "Maybe she's at a different facility?" "No," Clive insisted. "She told me this hospital, Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center." The woman typed again, double-checking, then triple-checked. She looked back at him, her voice cautious. "I'm sorry, sir. We've never had a patient named Kathleen Williams in our system." The words crashed over him like an avalanche. Kathleen never received treatment here. So where the hell had she been disappearing to every month while he stayed home, taking care of her aging mother? Where had all that money gone? His money. The long shifts, the second job, the savings he drained to cover the cost of treatment at the most expensive cancer center in the country? He stood there gripping those damn birthday balloons, his stomach hollowing out. He'd been lied to, used, and some things you just don't forgive. Some things you avenge. 5 years earlier. 5 years before this day, cancer had already taken his first wife, Mary. That was when his life split into 2 parts. Before and after. Before was filled with warmth, familiar routines, the scent of her shampoo in the morning, the quiet gurgle of the coffee maker, their conversations at the kitchen table. Mary always watched the morning news on CBS, could debate politics for hours, even when Clive had no interest in the subject. Then, suddenly the illness took over. Breakfast conversations turned into silence, and in her eyes, where there used to be certainty, he began to see fear. The kind they both tried so hard to ignore. When it was all over, he couldn't bring himself to stay in their old house. Every corner reminded him of what had been, of what would never be again. So he left. A new beginning, Lake Placid, New York, tucked away in the folds of the Adirondack Mountains, turned out to be exactly what he needed. The lake stretched out like glass, reflecting the deep blue of the sky and the snow-capped peaks of the forests. In the winter, skiers flooded in, carving trails down the same slopes that had once hosted Olympians. The old skating rink was still there, the one where the U.S. team had trained, the ski jumps, the Olympic Village, now just part of the town's fabric. But in the off-season, Lake Placid seemed to fall asleep. The streets emptied, the tourists disappeared. A peaceful quiet settled over the town. Small shops stayed open just for the locals. The cafes, which had been packed only weeks before, turned back into cozy little spots where everyone knew everyone. It was here that Clive felt something he hadn't in a long time, like he'd finally found his place. A place where he could be alone without feeling lonely. He bought a small 10-room inn, something between a bed and breakfast and a family-run lodge. He liked greeting guests, fixing things, keeping the fireplaces lit in the common room where travelers shared their stories at night. It gave him purpose when nothing else did. 3 years in, he'd already built his own little world in Lake Placid. He had his favorite places, his routines. One of them was a small diner off the road leading into town. Mornings here smelled like fresh coffee, warm muffins, and sizzling bacon. Clive stopped in almost every day, ordering his usual, eggs, toast, and black coffee. He knew everyone on staff. Carol, the owner, always had advice to give, even when nobody asked. Tim, the cook, grumbled about everything but made the best pancakes in the county. So, when Clive noticed a new waitress one morning, he paid attention. She approached his table, balancing a coffee pot in one hand and a small ceramic cup in the other. Her movements were hesitant, unsure. When she leaned forward to pour, she fumbled, spilling a splash of hot coffee onto the table, barely missing Clive's hand. "Oh, I'm so sorry," she gasped, grabbing a napkin in a rush to wipe it up. Clive smiled, shaking his head. "No harm done. Happens to the best of us." She let out a nervous breath, dabbing at the table again before lowering her voice. "Can I ask you something?" she whispered. "If you tell Carol I screwed up, she'll fire me before my shift's over." Clive arched an eyebrow, holding her gaze for a beat. "Well," he said, leaning back, "I suppose we can keep this between us." Relief washed over her face. She exhaled and smiled. "Thank you, sir. Just Clive." "Kathleen," she said, her voice quieter now, as if uncertain whether she should be introducing herself at all. The next time Clive stopped by the diner, she already knew how he took his coffee. Black, no sugar. Each time she passed his table, he'd catch a fleeting glance from her, a quick smile before she turned away. It was nothing really, just a passing moment, a small connection, but every time it left a trace of warmth in his chest. The next day they ran into each other again, this time at the park near Lake Placid. The air smelled of damp earth after the rain, and the pavement still glistened under the streetlights. Clive was on his way home from a walk when he noticed her near a bench, crouched down, fiddling with the laces on her boots. "Everything okay?" he asked, stopping a few steps away. She looked up, a little startled, but then smiled. "Yeah, just my shoelace," she said, finishing the knot. "Almost tripped over myself. Guess I'm just that clumsy." She gave a small laugh. "Though you probably already figured that out," Clive smirked. "You know, there's an old saying about that." She tilted her head. "Oh?" He nodded solemnly. "If your shoelace comes undone during a walk, it means the town has accepted you." Kathleen frowned slightly as if considering it, then narrowed her eyes. "You totally made that up." "Absolutely," he admitted, chuckling. "But it sounds good, doesn't it?" She laughed, a quiet, soft sound, almost shy. A few stray raindrops clung to her dark chestnut hair, catching the glow of the streetlights. Her eyes, warm brown like autumn leaves, held something familiar, a quiet depth, a flicker of sadness beneath the smile. It hit him then. She reminded him of Mary, not just the way she looked, though that was part of it, the delicate features, the slender hands, but more than that, it was something deeper, the way she carried herself, the way she looked at him in that moment. Maybe it was a sign. Clive never thought he'd feel this again. At 52, he figured that part of his life was behind him, the rush, the warmth, the pull toward someone new. But standing there with Kathleen, feeling something stir in his chest, something gentle, something real, he wondered if he'd been wrong. "If you're not in a hurry," he said, nodding toward the hill ahead, "there's a spot with a pretty great view. Want me to show you?" She hesitated for only a second before nodding, and so they walked together, slowly, letting the conversation unfold. She didn't share much about herself, just enough to say she was looking for a fresh start. Clive understood that. He'd been there once too. Clive hesitated for a long time before asking Kathleen out. After Mary's death, he never thought he'd be with anyone again. They had been married for over 30 years, since college, until the day she was gone. After her, there had been no dating, no late-night conversations with anyone new. That part of his life had felt closed. But now, he found himself standing in the hotel lobby, phone in hand, nervously turning it over in his fingers, trying to figure out how to phrase the invitation. There were too many questions in his mind. She's 22 years younger than me. Would she even be interested? Would asking ruin the quiet, easy friendship they'd built? He sighed, about to put the phone away. And then it rang. "Hey." Kathleen's voice was light, easy, as if she had no idea the turmoil he'd just been through. "I was thinking, want to grab a coffee after work?" Just like that, all the overthinking, all the doubts, gone. It was simple, as if it was always meant to happen this way. They started seeing each other after that. Kathleen laughed at his stories about tourists in the hotel, listened with fascination as he shared bits and pieces of his old life. But when it came to her own past, she was more guarded. She told him little, just that her father was a cruel man, an alcoholic, violent, that he beat her mother, that he beat her, that she learned young that no one was going to step in and protect them. So when she turned 20, she took her mother and ran. From that day on, she had only relied on herself. She worked as many jobs as it took to keep a roof over their heads. Within 2 months, Kathleen moved into his house. For the first time in years, Clive's home didn't feel empty. She brought her mother with her. Her mother had dementia, and Clive saw how patient Kathleen was with her, repeating things over and over, never losing her temper. Once he gently suggested moving her to a memory care facility, a place that specialized in caring for patients with her condition. But Kathleen refused. "I won't be one of those daughters," she said firmly, "the kind that just tosses their parents away when they become an inconvenience. She'd be miserable there. She wouldn't understand why I left her." Clive respected her choice and loved her for it even more. A month later, he proposed. It wasn't planned. It wasn't a grand gesture. They had just come back from a walk. The air was crisp, and Kathleen rubbed her hands together for warmth. Clive walked inside, shrugged off his coat, and went to the kitchen, pulling out a bottle of whiskey. "Want some?" he asked, pouring himself a glass. "Why not?" she said, taking the drink and immediately wincing. "Jesus, that's strong," he chuckled. "You're starting to sound like a local." For a moment, he just watched her, slightly disheveled from the wind, her cheeks flushed, her eyes glowing with warmth. He left the kitchen, went to the closet, and came back with a small box. No big speech, no build-up. He simply opened it and held out the ring. "Marry me." Kathleen froze. She didn't speak, didn't even breathe. She stared at him for a long time as if weighing something in her mind. Then, finally, she exhaled. "If you think you're getting rid of me that easily," she said, "you're mistaken." He smiled. "So, that's a yes?" Her fingers trembled slightly as she reached for the ring. "Of course, it's a yes." Their wedding was quiet. A simple ceremony at City Hall. No big event, no guests. Kathleen wore a light, elegant dress. Nothing fancy, just enough to make her look effortlessly beautiful. Clive dusted off his best suit, one he hadn't worn in years. His children didn't come. They had called, argued, told him he was making a mistake, that it was too fast, that he didn't really know this woman. But Clive didn't care. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he had the right to happiness. And then, just when it felt like life had finally settled into place, Kathleen got sick. At first, it was just little things. Kathleen seemed to tire more easily, sometimes complaining of weakness. She brushed it off, saying it was just seasonal fatigue, a lack of vitamins. But then came the pain. At first, it was mild, then it got worse, sharp enough that she would tense up, hold her breath, grimace when she thought he wasn't looking. One evening, as they sat in the living room, Clive caught her pressing a hand to her chest, fingers testing for something unseen beneath the fabric of her sweater. "What's wrong?" he asked, leaning toward her. She gave him a quick smile, but he saw the shadow in her eyes. "It's nothing." "Kath?" She exhaled, dropping her gaze. "Just a little pain," she admitted. "I should probably get it checked out." A few weeks later, she came home from the doctor with news that knocked the wind out of him. "Clive," she said it quietly, evenly, but her fingers clutched the fabric of her dress. "I have cancer." His heart stopped. "No." He sank into the chair as if his legs had given out. "No, Kathleen. Not this." He stared at her, at the calm, almost distant look on her face. "I've already scheduled treatment," she said. "A private clinic. They have excellent doctors." "I'm going with you," he said immediately. She shook her head. "No, Clive, I don't want you to see me like that." "That doesn't matter," he insisted. I'll be there." She reached for his hands, held them gently in hers. "You've been through this before," she whispered. "I don't want you to go through it again." He closed his eyes. Flashes of the past, the sterile hospital hallways, the beeping machines, the hollow look in Mary's eyes near the end. And now Kathleen was asking him to stay on the other side of it. "I just need to do this on my own," she said softly but firmly. Clive ran a hand down his face, his body slumping in quiet defeat. "Okay," he exhaled, "if that's what you want." When word spread around town that Kathleen was sick, people stepped up to help. Lake Placid was a small town, the kind where folks still looked out for each other. Even people who barely knew her seemed to care. Carol, the diner owner, started a fundraiser at work. Everyone chipped in what they could. One evening, Carol handed Kathleen an envelope. "You're not alone, sweetheart," she said gently. Kathleen opened it. A few $100s, a small note tucked inside. "Stay strong, Kathleen." People stopped by the house, bringing warm pies, fresh flowers. It was small kindnesses, but Clive knew they meant something. Every month, Kathleen spent a week at the clinic. She wouldn't even let Clive drive her there. "I'm in good hands," she always reassured him before she left. But something wasn't adding up. Clive had seen what cancer did to a person. He had watched how the disease drained Mary of everything she was, how the treatments took the rest, the weight loss, the frailness, the hollowed-out exhaustion. But Kathleen, she looked fine, better than fine. Her skin wasn't pale, her hair wasn't thinning, she wasn't losing weight like he'd seen before. In fact, every time she returned from treatment, she seemed almost normal. He mentioned it once, watching her move around the kitchen like nothing was wrong. "You don't seem as sick as you should be," he said cautiously. Kathleen smiled, shrugging. "I got lucky," she said. "They're trying new experimental methods. Less aggressive. It's working." She reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. "I feel like I have a real shot, Clive." While Kathleen battled her illness, Clive took on the responsibility of caring for her mother. The old woman was proud, never one to ask for help, but dementia and age were catching up with her. But it wasn't the caregiving that weighed on him most. It was the money. Kathleen's treatment was outrageously expensive. His insurance didn't cover the private clinic she had chosen, and the bills kept piling up. So Clive found a second job. Lake Placid always had tourists, hikers, skiers, people looking for a breath of fresh mountain air. He signed up as a tour guide, leading groups through scenic trails and historic sites. The job was grueling. He'd come home exhausted, barely making it to bed, before he had to wake up and do it all over again. And still, it wasn't enough. So he did the only thing left. He took out a loan. When he signed the papers, he didn't hesitate. If this was what it took to give Kathleen a chance, he would do it again, 100 times over. He had no regrets. 6 months passed. Kathleen's 31st birthday was coming up. She would be spending it in the hospital. Clive couldn't stand the thought of her being alone on her birthday. She had insisted, said she didn't want visitors, didn't want him to see her like that. But he didn't care. It was her day. So he planned a surprise. That morning, he bought the biggest bouquet he could find. He picked out a handful of colorful balloons, ones with "Happy Birthday" written across them, decorated with butterflies and stars. And of course, he grabbed a box of her favorite pastries. He could already picture the look on her face when she saw it all. She'd smile, maybe even laugh. For a moment, at least, she'd forget the hospital room, forget the sickness, and that was all he wanted. When Clive stepped into the hospital lobby, he was met by a young woman at the front desk, her uniform crisp, her smile professional and calm. "Good morning," he said, his voice unsteady. He swallowed, forcing himself to sound normal. "I'm here to see my wife. She's receiving treatment here. Kathleen Williams." She typed quickly, eyes scanning the screen. Then her fingers hesitated. Her smile faded just slightly. "Sorry, can you repeat that?" "Kathleen Williams." She checked again, then once more. A pause. "I'm sorry, sir," she said carefully, looking up at him now, her polite expression starting to crack. "There's no patient by that name in our system." For a second, Clive's mind refused to process the words. "There must be a mistake," he said, gripping the box of pastries tighter. "She's been getting treatment here for 6 months." The receptionist glanced at the screen, then back at him. Her smile was gone now, replaced by something more serious. "We've never had a patient named Kathleen Williams here." A slow, creeping chill ran down Clive's spine. "Maybe she's registered under a different name?" He barely recognized the sound of his own voice. "Try Kathleen Simpson. That's her maiden name." The woman typed again, checking every variation. She shook her head. "I'm sorry, she's not in our records." Clive felt his grip tightening around the bouquet in his other hand, the crinkle of plastic barely registering. He pulled out his phone and called Kathleen. She picked up after the first ring. "Hey," she answered, her voice even, normal. "Where are you?" he asked, keeping his tone steady. "What? Where are you?" A short pause. Then, effortlessly, she said, "At the clinic. Just finished my procedure." His breath hitched. "I'm here, Kathleen," he said, his voice cold now. "I'm standing at the front desk." Silence. "The receptionist says you're not a patient here." The line went dead. She hung up. Clive stared at the screen, his thumb hovering over the call button. He called her again and again. No answer. He stood there in the bright, sterile hospital lobby, balloons in one hand, pastries in the other, and for the first time in months he realized he had no idea who his wife really was. The drive home was a blur. His hands gripped the wheel, but his mind was somewhere else, trapped in an endless loop of questions, of half-formed thoughts colliding and unraveling before he could make sense of them. Kathleen hung up. She had never been a patient there. 6 months of treatments, 6 months of hospital stays, 6 months of him killing himself to pay for care she never received. Everything he thought he knew, everything he believed in, shattered in an instant. He barely remembered pulling into the driveway. All he knew was that by the time he turned off the engine, his head was pounding, and his heart felt like a clenched fist in his chest. And for the first time, he realized this wasn't just a lie. It was something much, much worse. When Clive stepped inside, he was surprised to find Kathleen's mother sitting in the living room. She rarely left her bedroom. Dementia had made her quiet, distant, like she lived in a different time, in a different world. But now, she sat up straight, and she was staring right at him. Her gaze was sharp, focused, present in a way he hadn't seen before. "Ben, sweetheart," she said. Clive froze. Ben. That was Kathleen's father's name. The old woman was looking at him like she wasn't seeing her son-in-law at all, but instead a man from her past. "I went to the doctor today," she continued, her voice steady. "He gave me a prescription. The medication is expensive. I need $2,000. Clive opened his mouth to respond, but she was already speaking again. "And Ketty needs 1,000 for the class trip to the waterfalls." A cold sensation crept up Clive's spine. "What?" She sighed, impatient now. "I told you, Ben." Her voice rose slightly, frustration creeping in. "It's important. The doctor said I'll get worse without those meds. And Ketty, you don't want her to feel left out, do you? All the other kids are going. Do you want her to be the only one stuck at home?" She was waiting for an answer, her eyes locked onto his, sharp, expectant. Clive didn't know what to say. "Selfish bastard!" she suddenly snapped, pushing herself to her feet. Her hands trembled, her face twisted with anger, anger that felt far too real. "You won't even help your own family? You think money just belongs to you? That it doesn't come with responsibility?" His heart pounded. Nothing about this made sense. And then it hit him. She wasn't just seeing Ben. She was reliving something. This wasn't just some confusion of dementia. This was a memory, a conversation that had happened decades ago. She had done this before. She had always done this. She hadn't asked for money. She had demanded it. And Ben, whoever he had really been, had given in. Over and over, just like Clive had. His throat felt dry. He swallowed. "Mom," he said slowly. "It's me, Clive." The old woman blinked. Something flickered in her expression. For a second, her gaze wavered. And then, just like that, the fire in her eyes died. She slumped back down onto the couch. "Clive," she murmured, almost to herself. She rubbed her forehead, shoulders sagging. I'm so tired," she whispered, as if the whole thing had never happened, as if none of it mattered. Clive stood there, his body stiff, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. For months, he had believed Kathleen's lies were about protecting him, that she didn't want him to suffer, to watch her struggle, to feel the helplessness he had felt with Mary. But now he saw something else. What if she knew all along exactly how to play him? What if she knew that if she asked, if she sounded weak, if she looked vulnerable, he would do anything for her, just like her mother had known with Ben, just like she had learned to do with every man in her life? What if it was all one big, carefully crafted lie? Clive sat on the porch, watching the road that led into town. The sun was sinking below the horizon, painting the sky in deep amber hues. He took a slow drag from his cigarette. He hadn't smoked in years. His mind kept circling back to the little things, the way Kathleen always averted her eyes when he asked about the medical bills, how quickly she changed the subject anytime money came up. Love makes a man blind. But he refused to be blind any longer. The next day, Kathleen came home. She stepped inside, bundled in her long coat, wind-tousled hair falling over her shoulders. She pulled off her gloves, set her bag down on the chair, and let out a breath, like she'd been carrying something heavy. Clive sat in silence, watching, waiting. "I need to tell you something," she said quietly. He didn't speak. She lowered herself into the chair across from him, folding her hands in her lap. She looked guilty, but not broken. "I haven't been completely honest with you," she admitted. "Yesterday, I told you I went to the clinic, but that's not exactly true." Clive leaned forward. "Where did you go?" She hesitated, then sighed. "I switched to a different facility, a cheaper one." His eyes didn't leave hers. "Why?" She pressed her lips together, then glanced down at her hands before looking back up. "I didn't want to take so much money from you anymore," she murmured. Right on cue, her voice wavered. Her shoulders trembled just enough. "I know you don't mind, but it's wrong, Clive. It feels like I'm using you. Clive studied her carefully, waiting for something in her expression to give her away. You should have told me from the start, he said. She ran her hands over her face, letting out a shaky breath. I was afraid you'd say no, she whispered. Afraid you'd insist on paying for the best treatment no matter what. And I can't stand watching you wear yourself out like this. Damn it, it was almost believable. Clive wanted to believe her, the tremor in her voice, the guilt in her eyes. But something didn't sit right. His instincts gnawed at him, telling him there was more. Still, he reached for her hands, holding them between his own. We're in this together, Kathleen. In sickness and in health. His voice was steady. But promise me, no more lies. Her fingers curled around his, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. I promise, she whispered. Clive nodded, but in his gut he already knew. Not all promises are meant to be kept. The truth beneath the lies. Syracuse, New York. The low hum of the radio filled the car. Coming up next, your late-night forecast. Expect temperatures to drop to 34 degrees with a chance of light rain. And now, a little something to keep you company on the road. Waylon Jennings with Dreaming My Dreams. Clive reached over and turned the volume down. He wasn't listening. His focus was on the glowing screen of his phone. A small red dot pulsed on the map. Kathleen's location. Not at a clinic, not at a doctor's office. She was here, at the Century Club, one of those high-end places where a glass of bourbon cost more than dinner for two at a regular bar. Large windows framed the entrance, golden light spilling onto the sidewalk. Inside, polished wood and soft jazz gave the place an effortless elegance. Clive pulled into an alley nearby and killed the engine. He stepped out into the cool night air, his heartbeat steady. A week ago, he had placed a GPS tracker under Kathleen's car, a small, discreet device, just another black piece among the machinery. All he had to do was open the app, and there she was. Tonight, he activated it when she told him, I'm heading to treatment, love. I'll see you in a week. She lied, and now he was going to find out why. He had known it the moment he saw that red dot on the GPS move further and further south, away from the clinic, away from therapy, straight to him. Now, he stood on the sidewalk, just beyond the glow of the restaurant's lights. The Century Club was the kind of place Kathleen never would have gone to alone. And she wasn't alone. Through the tall windows he saw her. A black dress hugged her frame, her blonde hair pinned into an elegant style. She looked beautiful. She looked happy. The earrings she wore, he had never seen them before. He had never given them to her. And she was laughing. Across the table sat a man, well-dressed, dark hair, younger than Clive. The man leaned in, whispering something. Kathleen lowered her gaze, smiling coyly before resting her hand on his shoulder. Then the man reached into his jacket pocket. Clive stiffened. A small black box. Kathleen gasped, bringing her hand to her mouth in a perfect performance of surprise. Clive didn't move. The man flipped open the box. A ring. Big. Flashy. The kind that catches the light, the kind meant to be noticed. All around them, the restaurant moved on. Waiters serving food, glasses clinking, couples chatting. But for Clive, everything faded into silence. The man took Kathleen's hand, leaning forward. Clive didn't need to hear the words. He read them on his lips. Will you marry me? And then, she nodded. She said yes. She kissed him. Clive felt something cold and sharp carve through his chest. He stood there, watching the woman he called his wife accept another man's proposal, watching her smile, watching her embrace him. But not tonight. Not now. There would be no scene, no confrontation. Because Clive wasn't done collecting evidence, and now he knew exactly what to do next. The plan. He walked back to his car, got inside, and started the engine. His hands moved automatically on the wheel, his eyes focused on the road, his mind empty. The radio remained silent. His world had just collapsed into 1,000 jagged pieces. Every moment over the past year replayed in his head. Every hour he spent working double shifts to pay for her treatments. Every night he spoon-fed her sick mother while Kathleen sighed about how tired she was. Every dollar he drained to keep her alive. And all that time, she wasn't just cheating, she was leaving. She had been building a new life, a new identity, a new story without him in it, and she had already said yes. Clive pressed harder on the gas pedal, the speedometer creeping past the limit. She had never loved him, not once. He wasn't her husband. He wasn't her partner. He was her investment, a wallet with no questions asked, a man she had drained dry. And now that there was nothing left to take, she was discarding him like an old, useless thing. She thought she had won. She thought Clive was nothing more than a kind-hearted, simple man. She had no idea what he was capable of. This wasn't over, not even close. She was going to regret this, regret everything. The road stretched out before him, long, dark, empty. But in his mind, a plan was already taking shape. Clive didn't give himself away. He didn't change his routine, didn't act distant, didn't start asking suspicious questions. Every morning he got up early, brewed his coffee, read the local paper, and helped care for Kathleen's mother, just like always. He made it seem as though nothing had changed. But now, he saw her differently. He noticed how effortlessly she lied, how easily she played on his trust, how she kissed him on the cheek before heading off to yet another therapy session. A little performance, as rehearsed as the ones she gave every man before him. Clive waited until she left. Then he got in his truck and headed for the Century Club. He knew exactly where he was going. The restaurant was busy, but not crowded. Clive took a seat in a dark corner of the bar, ordered a whiskey, no ice, and watched. Behind the counter, the man he had seen with Kathleen moved with confidence. Sten, the owner of the Century Club, that man, tall, well-built, about 42, short, dark hair, the kind of man who ran his business hands-on, greeting customers, pouring drinks, making sure everything was just right. The type who didn't mind rolling up his sleeves, who prided himself on the place he had built. A man who had no idea what was coming for him. Clive waited, and when Sten finally made his way over, he spoke. "Nice place. Whiskey's good. I'll take another." Sten nodded, grabbing the bottle. "Glad to hear it. First time here?" "Yeah, just passing through." Sten poured, set the glass down. "Been running this place a couple of years now. Took a while to get it going, but it's steady now." Clive nodded absently, glancing toward the TV where the Yankees were playing the Royals. Casual, just two guys talking over drinks. "Looks like you've done well for yourself," Clive said, lifting his glass. "Business, bar. And from what I hear, a woman who's got you thinking about forever." Sten smiled at that, leaning against the counter. "Yeah," he said. "Didn't think it was possible to meet someone like her at my age, but she changed everything." Clive took a slow sip. "Serious, then?" "Oh, absolutely." Sten's smile widened. "Proposed last week. She said yes." Clive felt his pulse hammer, but he didn't flinch. He let the words sink in, let them sit there in the dim light between them. "Congrats," he said smoothly. "When's the wedding?" Sten exhaled. "Still figuring that out. Got some things to wrap up first." Clive tilted his head. "Things?" Sten made a face. "Her divorce." "Of course." Clive set his glass down with a little more force than necessary. "Ah," Sten sighed. "Her ex was a real piece of work. Lazy, abusive. She put up with it for years, taking care of his sick relative, handling everything while he sat on his ass. She finally got the courage to leave him, but she's worried he'll make it messy." Clive felt something snap inside him. Kathleen hadn't just cheated on him. She had rewritten the entire story. She had erased him, turned him into some deadweight husband who held her back, a cruel, selfish bastard she had suffered under until Sten rescued her. And Sten had believed every word. Clive let out a short breath, swallowing down the rising heat in his chest. He almost admired her, really. She wasn't just a liar. She was an artist, a storyteller who could craft a reality that made her the hero every time. But this time, she had picked the wrong man. "Her ex knows she's leaving him?" Clive asked, voice steady. Sten shook his head. "She's afraid of his reaction, but don't worry. She's got me now. I won't let him hurt her." Clive leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the bar. "She's really that special, huh?" Sten didn't even hesitate. "You have no idea." Clive finished his drink and set the empty glass down. "Well," he said, reaching for his wallet, "then best of luck, my friend." He left a generous tip, stood up, and walked out into the night. Outside, the air was cold, crisp. Clive inhaled deeply, letting the fresh night air settle his mind. Sten had no idea. He truly believed every word Kathleen had fed him, and Clive couldn't even blame him. She was good. She was damn good. But this time, she had played her cards wrong, because Clive wasn't just another fool she could discard. He took out a cigarette, lit it, and exhaled slowly, watching the smoke disappear into the darkness. He wasn't going to confront her, not yet. That would be too easy. No, he would let this play out a little longer. He would let her believe she had won. because when he finally made his move, she wouldn't see it coming. Clive knew he wouldn't be able to uncover everything on his own. If he wanted the full truth, if he wanted to tear Kathleen's world apart, he needed someone who knew how to dig deep. So he found a man for the job, Mark O'Connor, a former cop, now a private investigator. 60-something, sharp-eyed, with a short-cropped head of silver hair and a trench coat that had seen better days. He worked out of a small office above an auto shop in Plattsburgh, surrounded by the smell of engine oil and burnt coffee from an old stovetop percolator. Mark wasn't in it for the money. He took cases to keep his mind sharp. He didn't waste words, didn't ask unnecessary questions, and he didn't deal in maybes. "You looking for dirt?" he asked, peering at Clive over the top of his glasses. "I'm looking for the truth." Mark nodded, took the envelope of cash without comment, and pocketed it. "Give me a few days." A week later, they met in a roadside diner just outside town. Mark slid a thick folder across the table. "You were right about her." Clive opened it. Newspaper clippings, court records, bank statements, and a mugshot Kathleen, younger, but still her. Same sharp, clever eyes. Innocent at first glance. Predatory underneath. "She's got a history," Mark said, stirring his coffee with a plastic spoon. "New Jersey's got an open warrant on her. Third-degree fraud. Criminal Statute 2C-24. Clive looked up. "Details," Mark exhaled, flipping to the relevant pages. A few years back, she cozied up to a guy named Douglas Whitman, big-time real estate developer. They were involved, at least that's what he thought. One day, she tells him she's got a congenital heart defect. Needs a life-saving surgery. It's expensive. No insurance. Clive gritted his teeth. And? She convinces him to pay for it, the whole damn thing. Over 120 grand, transferred straight to her. Mark tapped the documents. Bank statements, transfers. But there was no surgery, no condition, no doctor, no hospital had ever heard her name. Clive turned another page. Copies of emails, letters from attorneys. She vanished as soon as the money hit her account. Changed numbers, disappeared. Whitman hired a legal team. They proved the whole thing was a scam. Clive's fingers tightened around the paper. "But they never arrested her?" "She skipped town," Mark said. "Disappeared before charges could be filed. There's still an active arrest warrant in New Jersey. The second she steps foot in that state, she's done. But she's smart, stays mobile, moves between states, never sticks around long enough for anyone to connect the dots." Clive clenched his jaw. $120,000. And now she had done it again. Only this time the price tag was him. "How much time would she serve?" Clive asked. Mark leaned back. "Up to 5 years." Clive sat still for a long moment. He could go to the police, call New Jersey's authorities, let them know exactly where she was. It would be easy, but not enough. Mark studied him, reading the silence. "You're not turning her in," he said. Clive smiled. "No." Mark tilted his head. "Then what are you planning?" Clive closed the folder. "I'm going to destroy her." Mark twirled the coffee spoon between his fingers, considering. "Then you'll need more." "Get me everything," Clive said, standing up. "Every scam, every lie, every man she's ever left in ruins." Mark nodded. "This is going to be fun." Clive dropped another envelope of cash on the table and walked out. His revenge had only just begun. 3 days later, Mark called. "Clive, you need to see this." They met at the same diner. This time, Mark dropped a much heavier folder onto the table. "She's not just a con artist," he said, leaning back in his chair. "She's a professional." Clive opened the file. "She's pulled this scam at least 10 times. Page after page, photographs, names, articles from small-town newspapers. "In Pennsylvania," Mark continued, tapping a document, "she was Jennifer Lawson, a lonely woman battling a rare form of cancer. A man named Paul Danforth covered her treatments, sold his family business to pay for them. 6 months later, she disappeared with the money." Clive flipped to the next page. "In Texas, she was Catherine Spencer, a grieving widow with 2 children who never actually existed." Next page. "In Chicago, Alyssa Gray convinced a man to marry her, then cleaned out his accounts before filing for divorce." Clive snapped the folder shut. "How the hell has she never been caught?" Mark sighed. "The second someone starts asking questions, she vanishes, changes her name, her hair, her story. The men she scams rarely go to the police. Too embarrassed, too ashamed. And even if they do, without her in custody, there's nothing to charge her with." "Except for Whitman," Clive muttered. Mark nodded. "Yeah. He's the only one who got far enough to press charges. That's why there's still an active warrant for her in New Jersey. Clive leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. Now he understood. Kathleen had never loved him. She had hunted him, just like she had done to every other man before him. But she had made one mistake. She chose the wrong victim this time. Mark watched him carefully. "I can take this to the cops," he said. Clive shook his head. "Not yet." He wasn't in a rush. He wasn't interested in the easy way out. She was going to lose everything. The restaurant was full that evening. Jazz music hummed softly in the background. Glasses clinked. Conversations blended into a comfortable murmur. Kathleen sat at the bar, her elegant black dress hugging her frame as she traced a slow finger along the rim of her cocktail glass. She glanced at Sten across the room. He was busy chatting with a couple of regulars near the entrance. She felt restless, bored. Then, a woman slid onto the stool beside her. Kathleen barely glanced at her at first, until she spoke. "How long can you keep pretending everything's fine?" Kathleen turned, curiosity flickering in her gaze. The woman wasn't looking at her. She was staring at her drink, turning the glass slowly in her hands. She sighed, took a long sip, then muttered to no one in particular, "Men are trash." Kathleen smirked. "Oh, I hear you." The woman let out a bitter laugh. "You don't even know." Kathleen gave her a knowing look. "Oh, but I do." The woman finally turned toward her, eyes sharp, assessing. "I give everything to him," she continued, "and he can't even buy me flowers. And don't even get me started on money." Kathleen chuckled, leaning back. "Don't waste your time on one man," she said, swirling her drink. "Use them the way they use us." The woman tilted her head. "And how do you do that?" Kathleen took another sip, relaxing. "If he won't give you money easily," she said, "lie." The woman narrowed her eyes. "What kind of lie?" Kathleen smiled, setting her glass down. "Make him want to take care of you," she said. "Say you're sick. Say you need help. Let him feel like a hero. It works every time." The woman blinked. "You've done that?" Kathleen smirked. "More times than I can count." She didn't see the small glint of metal on the woman's collar. She didn't notice the way her companion barely moved, as if making sure the tiny microphone clipped to her shirt picked up every word. The audio recording was crystal clear. Clive sat in his chair, phone in hand, listening to every single word. Kathleen spoke without hesitation, without remorse, without doubt. This wasn't just something she did, it was who she was. Clive tapped the screen, stopping the playback. He had everything now. Documents, witness statements, criminal records, recordings. All that was left was the final move, and it had to happen at the Lake Placid horse shows. Her grand finale, the perfect setting. The entire town had gathered. The festival grounds were alive with color and noise. Families with children, teenagers with balloons, older residents catching up over cups of hot cider. The air smelled of roasted apples, fried dough, and maple syrup. In the main arena, the Grand Prix of Richard M. Feldman was in full swing. Riders from all over the world competed, their horses galloping through the course with precision and power. The final showdown was between Brian Mogre and his horse, MTM Vivre le Rêve. Flawless. Not a single penalty. When the announcer called his victory, the crowd roared in applause. The energy was electric. Perfect. Exactly what Clive needed. He and Kathleen walked side by side, weaving through the crowd. She smiled and greeted neighbors like nothing was wrong, like she wasn't walking into her own execution. But Clive saw the difference. The small stiffness in her posture. The way her grip on his arm felt colder than usual. She felt something. Some part of her knew. But she didn't know enough. On the main stage, a local orchestra played. Soft country mixed with old folk melodies. Children ran between food stalls, laughing. Teenagers dared each other to last the longest on the mechanical bull. Clive took in everything, every small, perfect detail. This was Kathleen's last day of freedom, and she had no idea. The giant screen in the town square flickered, broadcasting the live coverage of the festival. A journalist in a bright red blazer smiled into the camera, speaking enthusiastically about the town's traditions, the community spirit, the joy of gathering together year after year. The camera panned over the crowd, searching for familiar faces, making the moment feel personal, intimate. And then it found them, Kathleen and Clive. The journalist beamed, stepping toward them. The cameraman adjusted the focus, and suddenly, their faces appeared larger than life on the screen above the crowd. "Good afternoon," she greeted warmly. Tell us, how are you enjoying this year's festival?" Kathleen turned toward her with her practiced, effortless smile. "Oh, it's wonderful. It's amazing to see the whole town come together like this." The journalist nodded. "Absolutely. And actually," she said, tilting her head slightly, "I have one more question." Clive took a step back. Kathleen, still playing along, gave a relaxed nod. "Of course." The journalist didn't blink. "How many men have you scammed by pretending to be sick?" Everything stopped. Kathleen's body froze mid-smile. The air seemed to shift around them. All around, people who had been passing by, chatting, laughing, enjoying the festival, stopped in their tracks. On the massive screen, the camera zoomed in on her face, her wide eyes, her hand gripping the strap of her purse just a little too tight. "I'm sorry? What did you say?" Kathleen's voice wavered. The journalist didn't flinch. "I asked, how many men have you deceived, telling them you were dying?" A collective hush fell over the festival grounds. A second ago, the crowd had been celebrating. Now, it was watching. Kathleen let out a nervous laugh. "This must be some mistake. I don't—" The journalist cut her off. "Let's review the facts. $120,000 stolen in New Jersey, $85,000 in Pennsylvania, $64,000 in Texas." The screen behind them flashed with documents. Bank transfers, legal filings, mugshots, then photos of the men she had conned. Paul Danforth, who sold his family business to pay for her fake treatment. Douglas Whitman, who fought for years just to bring charges against her. Victim after victim. One by one. Kathleen stared at the images, her mouth slightly open. I don't... This is a joke, right?" she stammered. "This isn't real." The journalist wasn't finished. She lifted a tablet, tapped the screen. "Let's hear it in your own words." And then, Kathleen's voice boomed across the festival. "Listen, don't waste time on one guy. Use men the way they use us. If they won't give you money, lie to them. Make them feel like heroes. Tell them you're sick. Let them take care of you. It works every time." The crowd gasped. Kathleen stumbled back like she had been physically struck. A murmur rippled through the onlookers. Then, anger. "She lied to all of us. She said she was fighting cancer. She's a con artist." Her breathing turned shallow. Her face burned. This isn't true," she shouted. "It's been edited. You have to believe me." But they didn't. Something wet and sticky hit her shoulder. She looked down. A smear of warm apple saucer ran down the sleeve of her dress. Then, a crumpled paper bag flew past her head. A plastic cup followed, smacking against her elbow. Lemonade trickled down her arm. "Liar!" someone yelled. "Get out of our town!" More objects flew, popcorn, napkins, even a hat. Kathleen flinched, backing away, trying to shield herself. The noise rose, a wave of fury rolling toward her, growing, swelling, ready to drown her. She turned to run, but they were already waiting for her. At the edge of the festival grounds, 3 police officers stood by the barricades. The moment she turned, one of them stepped forward. "Kathleen Williams?" he said, pulling out his handcuffs. She stopped dead. No, this is a mistake," she gasped. I didn't do anything." Her gaze darted wildly through the crowd. And then, she saw him. Sten, her last hope. She lunged toward him, desperate, pleading. "Sten, tell them this isn't true. Tell them I wouldn't do this." Sten didn't move. His jaw was tight, his hands clenched into fists. There was no warmth in his eyes anymore. Kathleen grabbed his arm, her nails digging into his sleeve. "Please," she whispered. "You know me." Finally, Sten moved, slowly, deliberately. He reached for her hand and pulled the engagement ring off her finger. Kathleen froze. The final betrayal. "The mistake," Sten said quietly, voice like steel, "was trusting you." And then he walked away. Kathleen stood there, motionless, the crowd still screaming behind her. A hand grabbed her wrist, twisting it behind her back. "You are under arrest for fraud in the states of New Jersey and New York," the officer said, snapping the cuffs around her wrists. No, please, you don't understand," she screamed. I can explain. The officers dragged her toward the police car. The crowd cheered. Kathleen kicked, struggled, fought, but it was useless. The doors slammed shut behind her. She was done. Clive stood at the edge of the square, arms crossed, watching it all unfold. This wasn't the end. Not yet. There was one more step left to take. The courtroom was packed. People lined the aisles, leaning forward, desperate to catch every word. Former colleagues, Lake Placid locals, journalists from New York, the men she had deceived. They had all gathered for one reason: to watch justice take its course. Kathleen sat at the defendant's table, her hands clenched together. She looked smaller. Her once radiant face was hollow, dark circles etched under her eyes. Her expensive dress, which had once fit her like a second skin, now hung loose, making her look like a stranger inside her own body. Her gaze darted around the room, searching for support. There was none. Clive sat in the front row. Beside him, a row of men, victims, each carrying their own story of lies, love, and betrayal. As the judge stepped up to the bench, silence fell over the room. This court is now in session. A woman in a sharp navy suit, the prosecutor, stood. Your Honor, she began, her voice steady, strong. This is a textbook case of manipulation and fraud. The defendant systematically gained the trust of men, fabricated terminal illnesses, and exploited their kindness for financial gain, only to disappear the moment she got what she wanted. The total amount stolen exceeds $500,000. A ripple of shock moved through the crowd. Order in the court, the judge snapped. The prosecutor continued. In this room, there are 6 men who will testify to her deception. They will confirm under oath that her intentions were deliberate, that she knowingly fabricated her stories for personal profit. One by one, the victims testified. Each one described the same pattern: the tearful confessions, the desperate pleas for help, the gradual draining of their finances, and then the vanishing act. Then it was Clive's turn. He stood, his heartbeat steady. The prosecutor faced him. Mr. Williams, how much money did you lose because of Kathleen Williams? Clive exhaled. Money? He said. He let the question hang in the air before continuing. Around $70,000. A pause. But that's not the real loss. The prosecutor nodded. What do you mean? She stole more than money, Clive said, his voice calm, certain. She stole my trust. I loved her. I believed in her. I worked 2 jobs, took care of her sick mother, so she could get the treatment she never actually needed. He let the words settle. She didn't just take my money. She made me doubt people. She stole my faith in others. The room was silent. For once, Kathleen didn't interrupt, didn't protest, didn't lie, because there was nothing left to say. The verdict. The judge looked over the courtroom, then at Kathleen. Kathleen Williams. His voice was firm, unwavering. This court finds you guilty of third-degree fraud under New Jersey Statute 2C24 and grand larceny under New York Penal Code 155.40. A pause. The sentence is 5 years in state prison and full restitution to your victims. A sharp gasp escaped Kathleen's lips. Her head dropped, her shoulders curled in. 2 guards approached, handcuffs glinting. As they clicked shut around her wrists, she finally looked up. The last thing she saw before they took her away was Clive, sitting, calm, silent. He didn't smirk. He didn't gloat. He simply watched as justice was served, the final goodbye. 4 months later, the prison call came early, Kathleen requesting a visit. Clive stared at the phone in his hand. Curious. What could she possibly want now? Did she think he would forgive her? Did she think she could manipulate him again? He almost ignored it. But something inside him whispered, go. So he did. She sat at the metal table, hands resting on the cold steel. Her gray jumpsuit looked heavier than chains. Her hair was dull, her skin pale. She had aged in just a few months. She waited. And then Clive stepped in. He moved slowly, with purpose, his coat buttoned neatly, his hands in his pockets. He sat across from her, met her gaze. Neither of them spoke. Finally, Kathleen broke the silence. I knew you'd come, Clive smiled. I did too. She pressed her lips together, exhaled sharply. There was something in her eyes now. Not anger, not arrogance, not even fear. Despair. I have cancer, Clive, she whispered. I'm not lying this time. He didn't react. The doctors, they said it's late stage. Her voice cracked. He simply tilted his head. Say something, she begged, her fingers twitching. His voice was calm, even cold. Karma! Kathleen shuddered, her breath hitching. I need help, she whispered. A lawyer, someone to get me out early. I can't die in here, Clive. Please, you have to help me. Clive finally met her eyes. And what she saw there made her blood run cold. No sympathy, no warmth, no love, nothing. Help you? He asked, his voice almost amused. She nodded desperately. You were always kind, Clive. You loved me. Clive's expression hardened. I loved the woman you pretended to be. Kathleen's eyes burned with fresh tears. I was just trying to survive, she choked out. I never meant to hurt you. Clive's jaw tightened. He leaned in slightly. You know what I did with your mother? Kathleen's head snapped up. What? Clive held her gaze. I put her in a memory care facility, one of the best in the state. She's safe, well-fed, surrounded by nurses who actually care about her. Kathleen's lips trembled. But I was supposed to. She's better off without you, Kathleen. Tears spilled down her cheeks. She reached for him. Clive, please. If you ever loved me. He pulled back his hands, leaving her grasping at nothing. I won't save you, he said quietly. You're exactly where you belong. Kathleen let out a broken sob, her entire body shaking. Clive. He stood, buttoned his coat, stepped away from the table. She reached out again, desperate. Clive, please! Don't leave me here! But he was already walking away, not once looking back. The prison doors locked behind him with a solid clang. And Kathleen? She was left alone, in the place she deserved.